It's a cold winter day in Salem, Massachusetts, 1692, and the Paris household is marked with screams. The two children of the house are racked with seizures, fits. They complain of needle-like pains in the day and feverish nightmares in the night. The head of the household, Reverend Paris, has tried everything. He has called every herbalist, every apothecarian, every doctor he can, but all of them simply come and go. They find nothing to treat, no cures to give. Until one day, one Dr. Griggs suggests something that perhaps many were already thinking, that this was not the work of some physical malady or illness, work of something more insidious, of witches, of Satan's minions cursing them. This is the beginning of what we today know as the Salem witch trials. It was a set of criminal trials that killed around 19 people by hanging, and had an additional 2 more who died from poor conditions in jails before they could ever reach trial. Now, I want to address one popular myth about the Salem witch trials, as I'm sure you already know some of the basics of it. The popular myth is that this was all caused by poisoned rye bread, that due to poison in the water supply and in the bread, people began hallucinating evidence, that's why the Salem witch trials caught on as they did. That's why everyone blindly followed along. Modern historians nowadays doubt this for a multitude of reasons, one of which being that there were judges in Boston who spurred this along who would not be affected by any poison in Salem. The other being how slowly and erratically the fit spread. If it was a poison in the food supply, it would affect everyone all at the same time. And additionally, I want to also address the fact that popular media likes to depict the Salem witch trials as a homogeneous group of mindless zealots. Yet people did object, most prominently the families of the victims. They saw how haphazard and circumstantial the evidence was, and they pointed it out, not that it really did them much good in the end. Now you might ask, why does this matter? Why does it matter that this event over 300 years ago wasn't caused by hallucinations that a handful of people objected? It still happened after all, and it was so very long ago. Well, because it forces us to address how terrifyingly human these people were. They were thinking as clear-headedly as they could, searching for the solutions they could. And there were people who did see the actual right and wrong of the issue, and yet they were drowned out. Now, the Salem witch trials was not the first time that illness had caused a bout of popular violence, nor would it be the last. Another issue I want to bring up is the New England vampire craze. Now, this was a prominent belief in New England, as you might imagine, in the 18th and 19th centuries. It said that tuberculosis was caused not by germs, but by the undead, dragging the living down with them. Now, an important bit of context for this time period is that tuberculosis was simply a fact of life. It came for everyone. About 1 in 7 adults who would ever live in America or in Europe would die of tuberculosis. Just as the sun shined and the rain fell down, tuberculosis would take the ones that you love. And so the people of rural New England searched for their other solutions. One popular example of the New England vampire craze is the case of Mercy Brown. She lived in a rural farms town in Massachusetts, and she fell sick and died of tuberculosis, and her family came sick soon after. The townsfolk, believing that she had turned into an undead and was now dragging her family with her, dug up her body, cut out her heart, and fed it to her brother, believing that it would sever the tie between the living and the dead. It, of course, didn't work. The whole family would be dead before the new year. Now, one reason why I wanted to bring up the New England vampire craze is that, unlike the Salem witch trials, it was highly localized. The witch trials had supporters as far out as Boston, as I've mentioned. The Salem witch trials did not find quite as much favor in the cities. In fact, newspapers often depicted it as just as insane as we see it today. They called it backwards, insane, unknown sense of superstition. Thoreau even said in his personal journal that it was evidence that the savage still lived in civilization, a claim embedded with an incredible amount of eugenics that we don't really have time to get into today. And in this, we see we see something interesting. The people in the city still knew the same amount of tuberculosis as anyone in the countryside. Aside from a few minor hygiene campaigns, there had been no real effort or effective solution to tuberculosis. So why did they not follow along? What made them different from the people in the countryside? What gave them the privilege to look down and spit on these people? Well, when you examine the people who wrote these newspapers, you often find wealthy white men. Thoreau especially. And this was the class that was least affected by tuberculosis. When tuberculosis came for the cities, they had the capacity to run out to the countryside, sequester themselves away in quarantined country houses, and only send their servants out to brave disease-infected crowds. They had something to do instead of just waiting and praying and hoping it would all go away. And in that, we see that the Salem witch trials and vampire craze weren't really any innate problems. They came from circumstance. Take the person out of circumstance, and even if they knew the same amount of information, they wouldn't reach for the same solution. This was simply from fear, from people who didn't know what to do and reached for the simplest possible solution. That by punishing the bad person, we can make the bad problem go away. Now, you might still ask, why does this matter? Though perhaps disease may cause people to go irrational and engage in violence, we now know how disease works. And perhaps healthcare can't solve every problem, but certainly we have better odds than some 19th century farmhand. Surely, we would not fall for these things again. But the fact is that the connecting factor between the Salem witch trials and the vampire craze isn't disease. It was instead a lack of control. That these people had nothing to do, and so they did the only things that they could think of. But of course, there are still uncontrollable things today. Many things are beyond our grasp of change, and certainly things like politics and the economy will remain forever beyond the grasp of some of us for probably until eternity. And it's here we find the origins of the last part of my talk, fascism. Now, some of you presumably already know the basics of fascism. It was a political ideology popular just before World War II in Nazi Germany and in fascist Italy. It's defined by anti-Semitism and racism and a general sense of bigotry. Now, fascism, and in Weimar Germany, you all probably know the basics of the story. The government was essentially not there, the food prices were spiraling out of control, and so people returned to no one else but Hitler and his Nazis. But this is a somewhat simplistic story. The communists, of course, were also in Germany at the time, were just as well established and had just as radical solutions to the food problem. And yet, they still lost, despite the fact that the communists usually had better research points and already had a lot of backing in literature. And it is by comparing these two opposing political forces that we find what let fascism rise to power. The communists perhaps were better researched, but they spoke of complicated and radical things, of proletariats and bourgeoisies and means of production, of complicated statistics and radical plans that would change the most fundamental laws of how society worked. Meanwhile, the fascists spoke of a very simple idea. If we find the person responsible and punish them, everything would just go away. It has a seductive sort of simplicity to it. The idea was simply easier to understand, easier to incorporate, even if it had less backing and evidence. So, now, why do we care still? Well, because we aren't free from these same forces. Strickler, a more modern anthropologist, and a co-founder of Kickstarter, talks about what he calls the dark force theory of the internet. It's the idea that in a world with so many ideas, with so many contrasting solutions to complex problems, the ideas that are the most popular aren't the ones that are the most truthful or the most logical, but the simplest to understand. And there's nothing more simple than violence. It's the most basic solution that someone can come up with. Find the person responsible, kill them, and the problem will simply go away. And the fascists, I think, are very notable because of something that we don't often talk about, how quickly they went away. Joseph E. Periscoe, writing about post-war Germany, remarks dryly that one never seems to find a Nazi in Germany these days, save for the few at the dock at Nuremberg. In fact, we find that polling in Germany right after the end of World War II, over 70% of Germans thought that the Nazis were bad, that they deserved to be punished and to die for going too far. And which is strange considering that the Nazis were voted in. They were supported by the people. These were the people polled were the same ones who cheered on the pogroms and largely let the concentration camps be built up, either turning a blind eye or simply cheering on when it happened. And of those at Nuremberg, those war criminals and those who committed crimes against humanity who were to be punished, of the 3,887 cases out there, 1,416 were found guilty. And by 1950, all of them were released. Some of them served out their sentences. Others were pardoned. The Americans simply didn't want to keep paying for their jails. And yet, there was no resurgence of Nazism in Germany. Perhaps it would be dominated by political turmoil, but that was largely beyond the scope of Nazism. It simply passed like a fashion trend or a passing cold. In fact, some of them would even go on to write about how so very sorry they were. Albert Speer, the Nazi minister of war production, after he got released, continued to write about how he was so very sorry that he had fallen for Nazism, that he saw how wrong and evil it was, but simply couldn't do anything. This was despite the fact that during his term as the minister of war production, he actively pushed for more slave labor, and that he was a close friend of Hitler who was privy to most of his plans and continued to push for them. If he wanted to, at any point, he could have left. If he truly believed that Germany was falling too far into fascism, he could have simply escaped. Yet he didn't, because he believed. And yet, once the circumstances passed, the circumstances that took control away from the Germans and let Nazism take hold passed, he simply stopped believing in it. And this raises what I think is an existentially terrifying question. If you cannot tell someone who used to be a Nazi from somebody who wasn't, how can you tell someone who could become a Nazi from somebody who couldn't? The answer is that you can't. These people, there was no innate moral failure in them. Once you took them out of the circumstances, they were just as able to tell right from wrong as the rest of us. They were regretting the Holocaust before the bodies were even cold. And yet, they didn't stop it. The simple ability to tell the right from wrong when you were taken out of the situation didn't really shield you from it at all. And yet, these forces still control us even to today. Cancel culture, in heart, is an ideology based around punishment. And it seeks to solve the problem of systemic racism, not by trying to solve the culture or the politics, by simply punishing the people they see as guilty of it. And while it does start in good intentions, you find often that celebrities who genuinely do deserve to be punished by cancel culture simply either wait it out, or in the few cases where they are punished and actually do get canceled, are simply replaced by someone equally as bad within a few years. Meanwhile, others are caught in the crossfire and are often bullied towards suicide. And on an even darker note, there are the incels. And for those who are lucky enough to not know who incels are, it stands for involuntary celibate. They're a brand of misogynists who are unable to find romance and blame it on the woman for having too high standards, or not being willing to settle for anyone who isn't born rich or handsome. One might easily brush these people off as just people who are unwilling to take on responsibility. But to do that would be to ignore the over 50 people they have killed in the less than 2 decades they've been a formal group, often in suicide bombings or mass shootings that end with the suicide of the gunmen. They have gone out and killed people for what they see as their sins. And while yes, inceldom does not have the same stranglehold on America as Nazism did on Germany. But at the same time, they're also responding to a fundamentally imagined problem. Unlike the people in Germany, they would not have starved to death if they did not find romance, nor was anyone forcing them to. Yet they still responded to this imagined problem with violence. We today are still controlled by these forces. And one has to ask, what happens when real crisis comes to us? When we are faced with the same problems that created Weimar Germany, that the same mysterious illnesses that caused the vampire craze and the witch hunters. Do we truly think that we would be above the people of the past? They too were also thinking clear-headedly. They too also saw right from wrong when they were taken out of the situations. Even Reverend Paris, the main driver of the Salem witch trials, expressed regret about it a few years after it happened. I wish I could tell you there was a simple solution. One simple thing you could do to immunize yourself from fascism or witch hunting. And yet, there isn't. All there is to be vigilant. Vigilant of when we were pushing for punishment instead of healing, when we were calling for violence instead of actually confronting the core issues. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that separates us from the fascists and witch hunters of the past is time and circumstance. Time is always moving, and circumstances always change. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.